In the summer of 1985, the streets of Queens, New York, were heavy with tension. Outside the Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, traffic moved slowly through the warm evening air. Office workers were heading home. Tourists wandered between neon lights and crowded sidewalks. It looked like an ordinary night in New York City. But inside the Gambino crime family, something extraordinary was about to happen. At exactly 5:30 p.m., Paul Castellano, the boss of the most powerful Mafia family in America, stepped out of his black Lincoln Town car. He had just arrived for dinner. Within seconds, gunfire shattered the calm. Four men stepped forward from the shadows and opened fire. Castellano collapsed onto the pavement. His underboss, Thomas Bellotti, fell beside him. The assassination was swift, brutal, and unmistakably public. Across the underworld of New York, everyone understood what it meant. A new king had taken the throne. His name was John Gotti. But the story of John Gotti is not only the story of a mafia boss. It is also the story of a family, one that would spend decades living under the long shadow of his power, his crimes, and ultimately his downfall. Today, more than 2 decades after Gotti's death, the question still lingers. What happened to his children? To understand that story, we have to go back much further. Back to the streets where it all began. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27, 1940, in the Bronx, New York. He was the 5th of 13 children in a struggling Italian-American household. His father, John Gotti Sr., worked irregular jobs in construction and day labor. The money was never enough. The family moved frequently between cramped apartments in the Bronx and East New York, Brooklyn. By the time Gotti was 12 years old, he had already learned one of the most important lessons of the neighborhood. Power belonged to the men who took it. East New York in the 1950s was a hard place to grow up. Poverty, violence, and organized crime were woven into everyday life. On nearly every corner, young men watched the older gangsters drive expensive cars and command respect. For a teenager like John Gotti, the attraction was obvious. He dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School at 16 and began spending most of his time with a local street gang known as the Fulton Rockaway Boys. They were not yet part of the Mafia, but they were learning the trade. Truck hijackings, small robberies, gambling operations. These were the crimes that built reputations in the neighborhood. And by his early 20s, Gotti was already gaining attention from powerful figures within the Gambino crime family. One of those figures was Aniello Della Croce. Della Croce was a feared Mafia captain, known for his loyalty and ruthless discipline. He recognized something in the young Gotti: ambition. Under Della Croce's mentorship, Gotti moved deeper into organized crime. He became involved in hijacking crews that targeted cargo trucks at John F. Kennedy Airport. The operations were simple, but incredibly profitable. A truck carrying electronics or clothing would leave the airport. Somewhere along its route, it would disappear. The goods would be sold on the black market within hours. By the late 1960s, Gotti had become one of the most reliable earners in Della Croce's crew. But success in that world always carried risk. In 1968, Gotti was arrested for his role in a hijacking at JFK Airport. He was eventually sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. For many criminals, prison was the end of their career. For Gotti, it became a proving ground. When he was released in 1971, his status within the Gambino family had grown stronger. Loyalty during prison sentences was highly respected in Mafia culture. It showed discipline. It showed silence. And most importantly, it showed trust. By the early 1970s, Gotti had moved his base of operations to Ozone Park, Queens. It was here that he would build both his criminal empire and his family life. He married Victoria DiGiorgio, a strong-willed woman of Italian and Russian heritage. Together, they began raising 5 children. Victoria Gotti, the eldest daughter, was born in 1962. Then came John A. Gotti, often called Jr., born in 1964. After him were Peter Gotti Jr., Angel Gotti, and the youngest son, Frank Gotti. To neighbors in Ozone Park, the Gotti household looked almost normal. John was often seen walking through the neighborhood in expensive suits, greeting shop owners and friends. Children played on the sidewalks. Families gathered at backyard barbecues. But behind that ordinary appearance was a growing criminal operation. Throughout the 1970s, Gotti expanded his influence through loan sharking, gambling rackets, and hijacking crews. His reputation for violence became well known within Mafia circles. If someone crossed him, the consequences were swift. And yet, despite the danger of his profession, Gotti remained deeply involved in family life. He adored his children. Neighbors later remembered seeing him drive his kids to school, attend local events, and host large family dinners. But the illusion of normalcy shattered in 1980. On a quiet afternoon in March of that year, tragedy struck the Gotti family. 12-year-old Frank Gotti was riding a small motorbike near the family home in Queens when he was accidentally struck by a car driven by a neighbor named John Favara. The boy died almost instantly. The loss devastated the family. For Victoria Gotti, it was an unimaginable tragedy. For John Gotti, it was something else as well. In the weeks that followed, Favara reportedly received threats. The neighborhood grew tense. Then, for months later, Favara disappeared. He was never seen again. Although no charges were ever filed, many investigators believe the disappearance was an act of revenge. It was another reminder of the world surrounding the Gotti family, a world where loyalty and vengeance carried equal weight. By the early 1980s, John Gotti had become one of the most powerful captains in the Gambino crime family. But power inside the Mafia was never stable. Above him stood Paul Castellano, the official boss of the Gambino family. Castellano was a businessman more than a street gangster, focused on white-collar rackets and corporate-style crime. Many traditional Mafia figures despised him. Among them was John Gotti. Tensions between Castellano and Delacroix faction had been building for years. When Delacroix died in December 1985, the balance of power inside the family shifted dramatically. Castellano failed to attend Delacroix's funeral. For Gotti, that decision was unforgivable. It was seen as a sign of disrespect, and in Mafia culture, disrespect could be fatal. Within days, Gotti began planning what would become one of the most famous assassinations in organized crime history. The target was clear: Paul Castellano. On December 16, 1985, outside Spark Steakhouse in Manhattan, the plan unfolded exactly as intended. Castellano was dead, and John Gotti had just taken control of the Gambino crime family. Almost overnight, he became the most famous Mafia boss in America. Newspapers called him the Dapper Don because of his expensive suits and confident public appearances. Television cameras followed him outside courthouses and social clubs. Crowds gathered to watch him walk through Manhattan like a celebrity. But while John Gotti was rising to the height of his power, another story was quietly unfolding behind closed doors. The lives of his children were changing. Because growing up as the children of the most powerful Mafia boss in America came with a price. And in the years ahead, that price would begin to reveal itself. The legacy of John Gotti was only beginning. And for his children, the weight of that legacy would shape the rest of their lives. Part 2. By the late 1980s, John Gotti had become more than just a Mafia boss. He had become a symbol. In New York City, where organized crime had long operated in shadows and whispers, Gotti moved with unusual confidence. Cameras followed him outside the Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy. Reporters waited on sidewalks for a glimpse of the sharply dressed man with slicked back hair and a confident smile. The press gave him a name that seemed almost theatrical: the Dapper Don. But behind the headlines and tailored suits was the machinery of a vast criminal empire. And at the center of that empire was a family whose lives were becoming increasingly tied to his power. Inside the Gotti household in Ozone Park, the children were growing older, each navigating a life that was anything but ordinary. Victoria Gotti, the eldest daughter, had already begun building a life that moved partially outside the shadow of her father's world. From an early age, she had shown a strong interest in writing and journalism. Unlike many children raised around organized crime, Victoria did not embrace the criminal culture that surrounded her father. Instead, she pursued education. She studied at St. John's University in Queens, focusing on literature and journalism. For Victoria, writing offered something the Mafia world never could: distance. But even distance had limits when your father was the most famous mob boss in America. Throughout the late 1980s, reporters frequently tried to approach Gotti's family members. Victoria learned quickly how to navigate attention from the press. She spoke carefully, rarely about the Mafia, often about family. Meanwhile, John A. Gotti, known to many as Junior, was walking a very different path. Born in 1964, Junior had grown up surrounded by the men who worked for his father. He spent time around the Rave Night social club and the neighborhood businesses controlled by the Gambino family. For him, the pull of organized crime was stronger. By his early 20s, Junior was already working with his father's crew in Queens. Within the Mafia hierarchy, family loyalty carried enormous weight. Sons of powerful bosses were often expected to continue the legacy, and Junior appeared ready to do exactly that. Throughout the late 1980s, the Gambino family continued to expand its operations. Gambling rings stretched across New York and New Jersey. Construction companies quietly paid tribute payments. Loan sharking businesses generated millions of dollars every year. John Gotti ruled the organization with a mixture of charisma and intimidation. But law enforcement had begun to adapt. For decades, Mafia bosses had avoided prosecution through strict codes of silence. Witnesses rarely testified. Conversations rarely took place where police could hear them. But the FBI had begun using a new strategy: electronic surveillance. Agents secretly installed listening devices inside apartments, offices, and social clubs connected to the Gambino family. Investigators studied every word, every meeting, every financial transaction, and slowly, the walls were beginning to close in. Yet publicly, Gotti seemed almost untouchable. Between 1986 and 1990, he was tried several times on federal charges. Each time, he walked out of court a free man. Jurors were intimidated. Witnesses vanished. Evidence fell apart. The media gave him another nickname, the Teflon Don. Nothing seemed to stick. Inside the family, the atmosphere was complicated. Gotti's children were living through an extraordinary moment in American criminal history, but it came with constant pressure. Angel Gotti, one of John's daughters, grew up largely away from the spotlight. She maintained a more private life than her older sister Victoria. Friends later describe her as quiet and reserved, someone who preferred normal routines over public attention. Peter Gotti Jr., another of John's sons, also avoided the celebrity surrounding his father. But Jr. remained firmly inside the business. By the late 1980s, he had officially become a made man within the Gambino crime family, a formal initiation into the Mafia that bound him to its rules for life. For John Gotti, the decision to bring his son deeper into organized crime was significant. It meant that the future of his empire might stay within the family. But it also meant exposing his son to the same dangers he had spent decades navigating. And danger was everywhere. Inside the Mafia itself, loyalty was always fragile. Alliances shifted constantly between the 5 major New York crime families: the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo families. Each organization operated its own rackets, but disputes over territory and money could quickly turn violent. John Gotti's aggressive style made him both respected and feared. Some Mafia bosses admired his boldness. Others believed he attracted too much attention. The Rave Night social club in Manhattan became the symbolic center of his power. From a small storefront on Mulberry Street, Gotti held meetings, resolved disputes, and issued orders that affected criminal operations across the country. Federal investigators watched constantly. Across the street, hidden cameras recorded visitors entering and leaving the club. Undercover agents documented conversations and tracked financial records. The FBI knew that bringing down John Gotti would require something they had rarely achieved before: a cooperating insider. And in 1991, they finally found one. Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano had served as Gotti's underboss for years. He was one of the most powerful figures inside the Gambino family and had personally participated in numerous murders. But when federal prosecutors presented him with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of life in prison, Gravano made a decision that shocked the Mafia world. He agreed to testify. It was one of the most significant betrayals in the history of organized crime. For decades, Mafia members had sworn an oath known as omerta, a strict code of silence that forbade cooperation with law enforcement. Gravano shattered that code. In November 1991, John Gotti was arrested and charged with multiple counts of racketeering, murder conspiracy, and organized crime activity. This time, the case was different. Gravano's testimony provided an inside view of the Gambino family's operations. He described meetings, murders, and conversations that directly implicated Gotti. The trial began in federal court in Brooklyn in early 1992. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered once again. But the tone was different now. The confident smile that had once defined Gotti's public image was fading. The evidence was overwhelming. Secret recordings captured him discussing criminal operations. Gravano's testimony filled in the details prosecutors needed. For months, the courtroom became the center of national attention. Inside the Gotti family, the pressure was enormous. Victoria Gotti watched the trial unfold through news reports and television coverage. Junior faced the possibility that his father's entire criminal empire might collapse. For the first time in decades, the future of the Gambino family was uncertain. On April 2nd, 1992, the verdict arrived. John Gotti was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The man who had once walked through Manhattan like a celebrity was now heading to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of the most secure prisons in the country. But the story did not end with the verdict. Because while John Gotti was beginning the final chapter of his life behind prison walls, his children were about to face a future shaped by everything he had built. And in the years ahead, the weight of that legacy would prove impossible to escape. Part 3. On a cold morning in April 1992, the federal courthouse in Brooklyn stood surrounded by reporters. For nearly a decade, John Gotti had dominated headlines across the United States. He had been the face of organized crime in America, confident, charismatic, and seemingly untouchable. But that era had just come to an end. After the guilty verdict, federal marshals escorted Gotti away in handcuffs. The cameras that had once captured his confident walks through Manhattan now recorded a very different image. A Mafia king heading to prison for the rest of his life. For the Gambino crime family, the conviction created an immediate power vacuum. But inside the Gotti family, the consequences were even more personal. John Gotti was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of the most restrictive federal prisons in the country. There, he would spend nearly 23 hours a day in his cell, isolated from the world he once controlled. Communication with his family was limited to monitored phone calls, occasional visits, and letters. Yet even from behind prison walls, the influence of John Gotti did not disappear overnight. Investigators believed he still attempted to guide the Gambino crime family through coded messages and trusted intermediaries. And the man who appeared most likely to carry his father's legacy was his eldest son, John A. Gotti. Within Mafia circles, he was known simply as Junior. By the early 1990s, Junior had already been deeply involved in the Gambino family's operations. After his father's conviction, many members of the organization began looking to him for leadership. For a time, it appeared that the Gotti dynasty might continue. Junior officially rose to a powerful position inside the family, overseeing gambling operations, loan sharking businesses, and other rackets that generated millions of dollars each year. But the federal government had learned important lessons from the trial that brought down his father. Investigators were no longer simply targeting mafia bosses. They were targeting entire networks. Throughout the early 1990s, federal agents launched new investigations into the Gambino family. Wiretaps were installed, informants were cultivated, financial records were examined in detail, and once again, the spotlight turned toward the Gotti name. In 1998, Junior was arrested on federal racketeering charges. Prosecutors accused him of running the Gambino family while his father remained imprisoned. The charges included extortion, illegal gambling, and conspiracy connected to organized crime activity. Facing the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence, Junior made a decision that surprised many observers. He agreed to plead guilty. In 1999, he was sentenced to more than 6 years in federal prison. The conviction marked a turning point. After his release in 2004, Junior publicly claimed that he had left organized crime behind. In interviews, he insisted that he no longer had any connection to the mafia. Federal prosecutors remained skeptical. Between 2005 and 2009, Junior faced 4 additional federal trials related to racketeering and murder conspiracy charges. Each time, the outcome was unusual. The juries failed to reach unanimous verdicts. The trials ended in mistrials. After the 4th case collapsed in 2009, federal prosecutors finally decided not to pursue further charges. For the first time in decades, a member of the Gotti family appeared to step away from the Mafia world. But the legacy of John Gotti had already shaped the lives of his children in ways that could never fully disappear. Victoria Gotti had taken a very different path. While her father and brother were deeply entangled in organized crime investigations, Victoria built a career in media and publishing. In the 1990s, she worked as a columnist and writer, often discussing family life and personal experiences. Her most widely known work came in 1997 with the publication of her memoir, This Family of Mine: What It Was Like Growing Up Gotti. The book offered a rare glimpse into the private world of one of America's most infamous mafia families. Rather than glorifying crime, Victoria described the complicated realities of growing up in a household defined by secrecy, loyalty, and constant public attention. The memoir later helped inspire a reality television series. In 2004, the show Growing Up Gotti premiered on the A&E network. The program followed Victoria and her 3 sons as they navigated everyday life while carrying one of the most recognizable surnames in organized crime history. For audiences, the show presented a surprising image. Instead of mafia meetings and criminal operations, viewers saw school routines, family arguments, and ordinary domestic moments. It was an attempt to show that the Gotti family was more than the crimes that had made the name famous. But escaping that reputation was never simple. Angel Gotti also remained largely outside the criminal world. She maintained a quieter life compared to her siblings, occasionally appearing in media interviews, but generally avoiding the spotlight that followed the family for decades. Peter Gotti Jr., another of John's sons, faced his own challenges. Though less publicly visible than Jr., he also encountered legal trouble connected to organized crime investigations. The extended Gotti family continued to appear in law enforcement reports throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, reflecting how deeply the mafia world had once been embedded in their lives. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all was growing older inside a prison cell. During his years in Marion and later at the Federal Prison Hospital in Springfield, Missouri, John Gotti's health began to deteriorate. In 1998, doctors diagnosed him with throat cancer. The illness required surgery, radiation treatments, and extended hospital care within the federal prison system. Even as his physical strength faded, Gotti remained a powerful symbol within mafia culture. To some, he represented the last of the old-style street bosses who ruled through presence and reputation. To others, he represented the dangers of attracting too much attention. The publicity that had once made him famous had also helped law enforcement bring him down. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died in federal custody at the age of 61. News of his death spread quickly across New York City. Thousands of people attended his funeral in Queens. Long lines of mourners passed through the Papavero Funeral Home in Ozone Park, paying their respects to the man who had once commanded one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. For the Gotti family, it marked the end of an era, but the legacy he left behind did not vanish. Even decades later, the name Gotti still carries a unique weight in American culture. Books, documentaries, films, and television series continue to explore the rise and fall of the man once known as the Dapper Don. And inevitably, those stories return to the same question: what happens to the families of men who build empires in the shadows? For John Gotti's children, the answer has been complicated. Some stepped away from organized crime, pursuing careers, raising families, and attempting to live ordinary lives. Others remain tied, at least for a time, to the same world that had defined their father. But none of them could fully escape the legacy, because the story of John Gotti was never just about one man. It was about power, loyalty, and the consequences of a life lived at the center of organized crime. And for his children, that story continues to echo long after the empire itself has faded into history.